It's mid-December, we're just about a week and a half away from Emma being released, so what better time to talk about tier lists? Now, despite the fact that there hasn't been that many balance patches since the last tier list came out, there actually have been a lot of shifts in the meta lately, and a lot of characters that were underrated before have risen significantly from the last time we talked about it. Now, before we get into the tier list, I do want to clarify that this tier list is a tier list that encompasses all Qs. That means we're going to be evaluating the character and weapon combinations' general strength across all of the Qs, not just necessarily solos, duos, or squads. So without any further ado, let's go straight into the first character, which is going to be my evaluation of Glove Lee Dailin being put straight into S tier. Glove Lee Dailin is pretty much your gold standard of powerful characters right now. She's not the strongest character in the game, but she rivals absolutely everybody in the game with her outstanding damage, mobility, and utility at all points in the game. She barely has any weaknesses, and she has the ability to escape from just about any bad situation she may find herself in. And in all Qs, she's a powerhouse. She's good in solos, duos, and squads. She can carry, she can deal damage, she can bring utility, engage, disengage. She has it all. That's why Lee Dailin is firmly in the S tier slot, and she is an absolute powerhouse in Eternal Return. Now, as for the other variant of Dailin, which is in fact Nunchuck Dailin, I will only be putting Nunchuck Dailin at A tier. Now, here's the reason why. Nunchuck Dailin is in fact not all that great, but it is attached to Lee Dailin, who has such a strong kit that she's able to carry this relatively subpar weapon. The AMP version of Nunchucks, which is the Smiting Dragon, is essentially just a worse version of Frostpetal Hand and Buddha Palm, and the auto attack versions with the Vibro Nunchuck is pretty much just a worse version of the auto attack versions of Glove. So at the end of the day, it's just a worse version of Glove. However, it still is attached to Lee Dailin's kit, so it does get a firm A tier slot. Now, the next character on this list is actually going to be one of my favorite characters of all time, which is going to be Aya. Now, Aya has gotten a couple of changes since the last time I put her on this list. Previously, I had her AR skill rated somewhere in the middle. I had her pistol ability rated somewhere in the upper end, and sniper was all the way down at the bottom. But today, these days, I would put AR Aya in B tier, pistol Aya in A tier, and Sniper Aya also in B tier. I would in fact move them, the highest of Ayas down to the middle and the lowest of Ayas up to the middle. I think Aya, all of her versions are about the same in good tier. She's A tier in pistol, she's B tier in AR, and she's B tier in sniper. Previously, Sniper had been sort of underrated. We hadn't really taken into account how powerful the early game of Sniper was and how valuable that is in team modes. Also how valuable it is in solo for snowballing to a potential late game win through heavy mastery farming. And as for pistol strength has been slightly overrated lately, as pistols generally just aren't that favored in the current meta. Now, that's not to say that pistols aren't still good. They are still good. They are still able to take games. They do have a decent amount of utility, but pistol Aya in general just doesn't do too well against the actual S and A plus tiers in the game. So as a result, I do have to bump pistol Aya back down to A tier, although I do think she is quite good. Now, to follow up Aya, I'm going to now be talking about Hyunwoo. Hyunwoo is an interesting character and rather hard to evaluate. The thing about Hyunwoo is that while he does bring a lot of utility, you wouldn't expect him to also bring a lot of damage because he doesn't seem to have the best damaging abilities. His scalings aren't that insane. But the thing is that there's actually some builds that have been emerging lately that have been showing that Hyun might actually be an insane DPS character. So I'm going to be firmly putting Glove Hyun in A plus tier. This is with the caveat that if these semi-hybrid crit Hyunwoo builds end up emerging as powerful as they seem to be, he will be an absolute powerhouse to be reckoned with. Now, the issue with Glove Hyun is that he is very reliant on rare RNG materials, but if he does manage to secure them, if he does manage to make things such as Queen of Hearts, red shoes, auto arms, a bunch of mithril pieces fit on him really well too. If he gets all of those pieces, he is almost unstoppable, and his glove skill can crit for an absolutely insane amount of damage late game while still having insane defensive stats to keep him alive and in pretty much every fight that he wants to be in. Now, while Glove Hyun is quite good right now, I am unfortunately going to have to put Tonfa Hyun in C tier. Now, the reason why Tonfa Hyun is only in C tier is because, unlike the Dailin nunchuck to glove comparison, Tonfa Hyun really loses a lot of its strength when you lose glove. Glove skill gives Hyun a lot of his damage follow-up, whereas Tonfa skill at the moment just isn't good enough to warrant using Tonfa Hyun. Tonfa Hyun is really only good for griefing early with a Plasma Tonfa and using it as an early rush strategy to back up your team while giving them a CC bot and someone tanky to help them out. That being said, Tonfa Hyun really just doesn't do enough to warrant a spot higher than C tier on this tier list. And moving right along, we're going to be talking about Shoichi. Shoichi was a character we weren't able to fully evaluate on this last tier list because unfortunately he got nerfed right after we ended up recording the entire tier list. So it's kind of up in the air where Shoichi should be landing, but after having seen a lot of Shoichis play the game, this might surprise you to find out that I would put Shoichi in A tier. Yeah, A tier. The weird thing is that Shoichi is actually a lot better than people give him credit for. Especially in team modes, Shoichi is a really good funnel target. If you focus a lot of your efforts on making sure your Shoichi builds very quickly, very early, he can actually be an insane hyper carry that can carry your entire team into the late game. Now, that's not to say that he can't also do well in solos, but if you were just being rated on his solo performance, he would probably be closer to B tier. However, since this tier list does encompass all three game modes, I have to say Shoichi does firmly fit into A tier as a potential funnel hyper carry. One more thing about Shoichi is that one of the things that's slightly holding him back is that people kind of just haven't gotten good enough at Shoichi yet to really accentuate his good qualities. There haven't been enough insanely good players to really show off how good he can be given the right circumstances and the right micro mechanics. Now, moving on to our next character, we're going to be talking about Fiora. And unfortunately, Fiora is one of the toughest characters for me to even evaluate at all on this tier list because she has been changed significantly in the last balance patch. The thing about Fiora is that she got most of her kit shaken up when they moved the slow from her E over to her Q. But at the same time, they also made her Q much longer and much faster to come out. Now, by doing this, what they did was they basically completely changed how they want Fiora to work, and since there hasn't been that much time for us to really see all of the use cases of the new Fiora, it's really hard to actually evaluate her strengths. But based on what I have seen, I will be rating Spear Fiora in A tier, because Longinus Spear Fiora Genshin Silvergun with the transition into the Longinus Spear Fiora is still quite a good build. Ashen has shown it can be a good build, having played very well in the most recent tournament, having won several games, and actually winning the whole tournament overall. I know that this character can be rather hard to play given the new changes, but the evidence is there that she can actually perform in the right circumstances. You just have to know how to transition into Longinus in the late game after you get that VF blood sample. Now, as for the other two versions of Fiora, you don't see a lot of two-handed sword Fiora anymore, and you don't see a lot of Rapier Fiora, but from the ones I have seen, I would have to place Rapier Fiora somewhere in C tier. It's just performing under where I would like it to be at the moment. The auto attack rapiers are not that well statted at the moment, and I don't think that Amp Fiora is that amazing with Mistleton either. And as for two-handed sword, I would have to place it firmly in B tier, between Spear and between Rapier. Two-handed Fiora doesn't really do that much for Fiora. The reason why Spear Fiora works so well is that the stats on the spears are so high, it accentuates the rest of the features of her kit very well. While parry is an amazing weapon skill, it's just not enough to elevate two-handed sword above its weapon-based stats. So unfortunately, it will be landing in B tier. It's still good, it can still win games, it's not bad. Remember, B tier is not a bad evaluation, but it is going to land slightly below Spear. And coming up next on the list is going to be Magnus. Magnus is a character that I love dearly, and while we don't see that many Magnuses on the NA server, I do know that Magnus does have a good amount of strength, and I run a lot of Magnuses in a lot of my squad and duo team comps. I know that Magnus has strengths, but I also know that Magnus has a lot of weaknesses as well. And as a result, very similar to the last tier list, I'm going to be placing Magnus, both bat and hammer, in B tier. A lot of the times, Magnus's strength is often defined by the areas around him and where fights take place. A lot of his strength can be stripped away from him by simply just not being near a wall for him to stun you. When Magnus loses his convenient wall stun, he loses a lot of his kit's synergy. He also loses a lot of his kit's strength. Keeping a person in place is really what he needs to do to get his full combo off, and without that, Magnus is just simply not that powerful. So as a result, since he does have such glaring flaws in his kit, I'm going to have to put him at B tier, although I do know that he can bring a lot of strength in the right circumstances. And to follow him up, we're gonna talk about Yuki. Now, Yuki has gotten a new weapon type since the last time we did put out a tier list, so I'll be first evaluating the dual swords version of Yuki. And I gotta say, despite having played him a decent amount since its release, I have to put Dual Swords Yuki in C tier. It's simply just not that good, and honestly, it's skirting the line between C tier and D tier. But the thing that's keeping it from being fully in D tier is the fact that you can still go Amp Dual Swords Yuki and combine it with an Amp Dual Swords Jackie, which leads to a very, very powerful duos and squads team comp that can shred enemy teams with very little effort. While it's not the most consistent or reliable strategy in the world, it is actually very powerful, so I do have to give it some credit, and that does warrant him being on the C tier of this list. And as for regular two-handed sword Yuki, this is actually where things get a little interesting. Two-handed sword Yuki is in A+ tier. Actually, he's skirting the line between A+ tier and S tier. Dual Swords Yuki is actually insane. I had a lot of internal struggle and confusion as to whether or not I should put him in A+ tier or S tier, but when comparing him with the actual S tiers in the game, I couldn't quite place him in that S tier category. The reason why two-handed sword Yuki is so good is because the parry matches so well with his kit, and the actual stats of the two-handed swords with the mastery, it matches very well with his kit. He wants to be dealing a lot of damage in very short bursts. He wants to be given these extra tools to prevent heavy damage using the parry skill. Parry is just so good with Yuki's kit that it elevates him all the way up to A+ tier. Don't sleep on two-handed sword Yuki, he is very good as a character. And next on this list is going to be another character similar to Magnus, whose evaluations haven't changed much since our last tier list, and that's going to be Zahir in B tier with both throw and shuriken. Zahir has a lot of good points to him. He's very strong in the right circumstances. If he manages to land all of his skills, he can do a lot of damage from range, and he's able to kite melees extremely well. Now, with all of that being said, he still is in B tier. And the reason is that despite the fact that his damage and mobility is high if he manages to land everything, Zahir is very difficult to land everything with. He is an incredibly high skill cap character with some very difficult to land skill shots. His Q is not the most reliable thing to get on your opponent and is very easily dodged and countered, and if he doesn't manage to land his Q or his E, he is sort of left out in the cold with no tools to work with. So for all of those reasons, Zahir, he's a good character, he's not broken, he's not overtuned or undertuned, and that places him very firmly in B tier. Now, this next character on the list is going to be our second addition to the S tier, and you probably already know who it's going to be. This character is a powerhouse in all three Qs. This character is very difficult to deal with and has little to no counterplay against their ultimate. And of course, I'm talking about Xiukai with the spear. Now, it should come as no surprise that Spear Xiukai is an S tier character in this game. He has one of the best buttons in the game, which is his ultimate, that gives him the ability to turn any fight in his favor. It's almost undodgeable because he can lock onto you by right-clicking you after he activates it. It also has the ability to shred defense, which makes him an insane utility tool in team modes. Plus, he already has the ability to make all of the food on your team significantly better while buffing the damage on all of his skills and buffing his max HP at the same time. I don't need to say too much more about this character. He's absolutely insane, and his utility is insane, and his damage is insane. Now, that was me talking about Spear Xiukai, but where does Dagger Xiukai fit into all this? And the truth is that Dagger Xiukai actually shows up right around the same point, right at A+ tier, and that's because despite the fact that he loses the Spear weapon skill, which benefits him far more than the Dagger weapon skill, he is still Xiukai. He does still have the same ultimate with the same passive with the same scalings. So as a result, we still have Xiukai in A+ tier. Additionally, him having access to Dagger gives him alternate backup routes in case any Fangshan Huaji build paths are too contested. It just makes him an even better character overall. It's kind of insane that they would give a character this strong another weapon type that benefits him so much. Now, moving on from one of the strongest characters in the game, we're gonna go right down into one of the weakest characters in the game, which is going to be Crossbow and Bow Nadine. Crossbow Nadine, in my opinion, lands roughly in the B tier range right at the moment, and Bow Nadine, unfortunately, is going to be one of my C tier inclusions on this list. Nadine has seen better days. Nadine has been nerfed many times in the last few patches. Crossbow has been nerfed repeatedly, bows have been nerfed a decent amount too, and Nadine as a character has just not been too favored in these last few patches. Additionally, in team modes, she has had her damage reduced to around 82 to 83%, which is not that good for a single target ranged auto attacker. She just doesn't have that same spice she had before, and I'd like to see some buffs to her late game while maybe potentially nerfing her early game to help even out her damage scalings, because right now her early game is actually quite strong, with her late game really being lackluster and falling off against all of the top tiers. And to move on from Nadine, we have another sort of hard to evaluate mid to low tier character, which is of course going to be Hyejin. Now, Hyejin, this may come as a surprise. Hyejin has been only nerfed since the last time we talked about her, but I'm going to be increasing her rating from, I believe I put her at C tier before, I'm going to be putting her at B tier this time. Our B tier is filling out quite nicely. The thing about Hyejin is that there have been some alternate routes and alternate playstyles that have been found for Hyejin. With the more tankier, beefier versions of Hyejin, with Golden Ratio and even some emerging on Ancient Bolt, Hyejin is actually quite versatile and has a lot of options to potentially scale better into the late game by utilizing RNG items such as Hermes Boots, Queen of Hearts, and Auto Arms. And to continue off of that, we're gonna move on to Shuriken Hyejin, which unfortunately it might be the lowest rating we're gonna give a character on this tier list. Shuriken Hyejin just falls short at every single metric in the game. There truly is no reason to play Shuriken Hyejin over Bow Hyejin. Shuriken Hyejin just excels at nothing and is weak at everything. The stats back this claim up, and no one has managed to show a build that really turns any heads. I can't say that Shuriken Hyejin belongs anywhere but D tier on this tier list. Now, I bet you're sitting there and I bet you're asking yourself, wait a second, where the heck is Jackie gonna go? Jackie's got 4 different weapon types. I have no idea where you're gonna put Jackie on this tier list because there's so many different ways to play her. And in reality, it is actually kind of hard to evaluate all 4 of them as if they were all the same character because they all play so differently. But at the end of the day, I think I've settled on some evaluations for Jackie that I think are fair, and that would be A+ tier for two-handed sword Jackie, as well as A tier for dual swords Jackie. These are the 2 better versions of Jackie in my humble opinion. I think two-handed sword Jackie is one of the best wielders of mithril RNG items such as auto arms and Hermes boots for melee characters. Similar to two-handed sword Yuki, they play fairly similarly. They're going to be utilizing that two-handed sword parry in a very convincing fashion to deal a lot of damage early game, deal a lot of damage late game, and have a lot of survivability, utility, chase, and sticking power. And as for Dual Swords Jackie is slightly falling out of favor in the meta. It's not quite as strong as it was in the last few patches, but it's still an incredibly strong solo tool. It's still an incredibly strong pub stomper. I do think Dual Swords Jackie does warrant the A tier spot on this list. However, you should take this with a grain of salt that this is mostly to do with solo queue. And as for the other two versions of Jackie, similar to their previous evaluations, they will be going into B tier where they solidly sit. Dagger Jackie and Axe Jackie are about the same in terms of power levels. They play completely differently, but they're just not that amazing, but they're also not that weak. Jackie is a good and versatile character, but these weapon types fall slightly short of two-handed sword and dual swords in comparison. And coming up on the list next is going to be our evaluation of Adriana. Adriana is one of the harder characters to evaluate on this tier list, and it may surprise you where I'm actually going to put her, or not, because she's not that strong. I'm going to be putting her in C tier. Adriana is consistently okay to slightly below average. She's pretty decent in duos, she's pretty decent in squads. She's not amazing, she's not blowing anybody's mind, but she's fun to play, people like her. She's not a terrible character, she's got good utility, but she's just not that great. I will say, however, that Adriana has received some buffs since the last time we evaluated her on this tier list, so I have to say she is better than she was before, but she still isn't quite in B tier with the rest of the characters in B tier. And next on this tier list, we're going to be talking about Isol. Isol may have been one of the characters that I was sleeping on the most in the last tier list. I evaluated him somewhere between, I believe it was C or D tier. Isol, in my honest opinion, has shown that with the assault rifle, he is way better than I expected and might just be an A tier character. Isol's early game is potentially one of the most deadly with the assault rifle. Once he finishes an AK-12, Crusader's armor, and a variety of other crit pieces, if he has any combination of Crusader's armor plus AK-12, he can win essentially any fight in the game as long as he gets the jump on his opponent. And although I did mention that it was an early game focused strategy, it's not like it doesn't scale into the late game. AR Isol is a significant powerhouse in both duos and squads and can be played in solos as well, but he really does shine with a team to back him up in the late game. And as for Pistol Isol will be unfortunately dropping down to about, it's tough between B or C tier. If there was a C plus tier, I would probably place him there. But for fairness sake, I'm going to be putting him in B tier. Pistol Isol is quite decent, and I think that he is actually just being overshadowed by AR Isol. He's still a decent character, especially in duos or squads where Isol really does shine. But he's not quite A tier, and he's just barely hanging on to that B tier position, although he does bring a lot of utility with his ability to Q chain onto an enemy to basically ensure that they get rooted over and over and potentially picked off early in a team fight. His ultimate also gives him a lot of zoning potential, and the fact that he can place traps so fast makes him an amazing trap placer in both team fights and in solo play. And as we wind down into the very last few characters in this tier list, I will be evaluating the newest character in the game, Silvia, in B tier. Don't get me wrong, Silvia is extremely fun to play. I love Silvia as a character. She's pretty much everything I ever wanted in a character in this game, but she has some things holding her back at the moment, and one of the biggest issues she has is probably one of the weirdest issues that you wouldn't expect. And that issue is that Silvia struggles to fight basic animals at the beginning of the game to get the leather to finish her weapons. The thing is that almost every pistol in the game, to get from a white pistol to a green pistol, requires you to get a leather, and leather only drops from animals around the map, so you have to be strong enough to kill them and beat them. But the thing is that Silvia has the absolute weakest early game of all of the pistol characters, with an incredibly low attack speed and very low base damages on all of her skills and her auto attacks, so she struggles to fight even the most basic of animals, and she only has a small percentage chance of getting leather off of chickens and bats. So what that means is that her early game is a complete dice roll as to whether or not she will get the stuff she needs as soon as she can, and there's a chance she'll just get killed or kill her momentum by low rolling on leather on chickens and bats. I think if they improved Silvia's ability to kill early game animals by a significant amount, or if they made it that pistols did not have to craft out of leather in order to get past the most basic of pistols, which is kind of a ridiculous concept if you think about it, Silvia would probably raise into maybe A tier because she's actually kind of good. She's good in teams, she's good in solo play. With the right builds, she is kind of a strong character, but in her current state, she's just going to be B tier because she is held back by that incredibly high variance early game. And of course, we're coming into the last 3 characters on this tier list, and they're some of the spiciest evaluations in the whole list. And the first I want to cover is going to be Sissela, because she has gotten a new weapon type as well. Now, here's the thing. Sissela, she's pretty good, right? Like, everyone knows she's pretty good. You know for a fact she's probably not going to land in these bottom tiers. She's probably going to be somewhere near the top, but the question is, where does Shuriken rate versus throw? And it's my honest opinion as someone who plays a ton of Sissela that Shuriken Sissela only lands in A tier. And of course, that means that Throw Sissela will be landing in A plus tier. Now, I have to clarify that this is only by the thinnest of margins. I think Throw Sissela and Shuriken Sissela are incredibly close to each other in terms of power levels. However, there are a few things that are differentiating them, and I'd like to highlight that real quick. In favor of Shuriken, I have to say that Caltrops is an absolutely amazing weapon skill. It fits Sissela's kit like a glove. It gives her an extra zoning tool that she can even pull enemies through or just pull enemies away from if they happen to get too close to you. And additionally, Shuriken has some of the easier build paths compared to Throw. Throw's build paths are pretty terrible. They're generally 3 zones and they're generally through very contested areas. And weapons like Azure Dagger and Wind and Fire Wheels, they're pretty easy to craft. But with that being said, this is where Throw actually pulls just slightly ahead of Shuriken. The throw weapon stats are just so significantly better than the Shuriken stats that it really will pay off if you manage to finish a throw build. Additionally, throw weapons just have significantly better mastery than Shurikens. They bring way more damage to the table while sacrificing just a little bit of attack speed, which is not that important of a stat on Sissela to begin with. Additionally, even beyond that, the throw range on your auto attacks is so much longer than Shuriken, and if you go from Shuriken to throw, or if you go from throw to Shuriken, you're gonna really notice the difference between the two. Now, here's where throw loses a few points compared to Shuriken, and that is in the weapon skill. Smokescreen is just not that good, especially when you're comparing it directly to Caltrops, which does so much more damage, has so much more of a zoning and spacing effect on the fight. It's significant how different the two of these skills is, and it does make throw slightly worse. Now, if Smokescreen were to be buffed, it would be almost objectively better than Shuriken in every way, but for now, they are very close to each other. I just find myself going back to throw every time because I miss the raw damage, the extra range, everything that throw does bring. And to move on from Sissela, we're gonna go to one of our 2 final placements, which is going to be Chiara. Now, Chiara's placement should at this point be obvious. If at this point you do not know where Chiara goes on this tier list, I encourage you to play more Eternal Return because it should be fairly obvious after just a few games. Chiara is definitively an S tier character. I don't know what more I can say that hasn't already been said about this character, but I will say that since the last patch where she was also an S tier character, the thing that has sort of developed for this character's kit is that people are now slamming all of the Mithril, Auto Arms, Hermes Boots, any high defense rare RNG item you can find in the game. You slam it on Chiara and it's absolutely insane. She holds it better than literally everybody else because she has so much built-in healing to her kit. She also has so much chasing and kiting potential while being the fastest character in the game. All of these stats are insane on her, and it makes her an unkillable tank machine that just shreds enemies like it's nothing. This character is essentially the most powerful character in the game, in my opinion, potentially broken, should definitely see nerfs in the next few patches, or I'll be severely disappointed. And again, there's not much more to say about Chiara, so I'm going to move on to the final evaluation on this tier list, which is Hart. And I have to say, Hart was one of the places where I was so absolutely incredibly wrong about her placement. In the last tier list, I believe I placed her somewhere in the middle or maybe even near the bottom of the tier list. But I have to say, after a lot of extensive testing on Hart, after finding what I believe to be the best Hart build in the game, I have to firmly place Hart in A+ tier. Now, she does ride a fine line between A+ tier and A tier. She does have her flaws. She is a single target character, but here's the thing about Hart. She has potentially the highest burst in the entire game. If you build her with a Purple Haze, if you build her with Rocker's Uchiwa and a lot of other high amp but also high defensive items, she is an insane bursting powerhouse. She can delete pretty much anyone who's under 2000 HP in one full rotation, while also having a lot of mobility and CC to back it up, as Charm is one of the most insane skills in the game, and she gets it for free as her weapon skill. But again, Hart is not without her flaws. She does have basically no W. She also basically doesn't have a passive. She's essentially a 4-button hero between her Q, E, ultimate, and her weapon skill. And her ultimate is, while in my opinion, actually quite a good fight reset skill and has a lot of very, very powerful interactions with other characters in squad and duo, it is still a slightly weaker ult than some other ults, and it makes her only really an A+ tier character and not S tier. And again, her W and her passive, they basically just don't exist. And with that being said, that's going to be the conclusion of my tier list for the Silvia patch. I'm actually curious if you guys thought that this tier list shaped up the same way you expected. If there's maybe some evaluations that you thought should have been higher or lower, I do want to hear it. Like, for example, in the last tier list, I saw maybe a couple comments that said, you know, you're really undervaluing AR Isol. He's actually a lot better than you think he is. And it turns out they were completely right. AR Isol was so much better than I'd ever given him credit for. So I want to know what you guys think. Leave a comment, let me know what you think. I'll be reading them all because I do find it really fun. But in any case, guys, I will be catching you guys in the next video. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season.